Don't blink, because if you did, you missed it. A half step backward, a hand that didn't land where it usually does, a pause that lasted just a beat too long. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And suddenly, the most photographed couple in the modern royal era looked like two people who didn't quite know how to stand next to each other anymore. What happens when a public display of unity turns into a public question mark? That's the question people are still arguing about after Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped onto the red carpet at the Sundance Film Festival in Utah for the premiere of their documentary Cookie Queens. This was supposed to be a victory lap, a moment of reinvention, a controlled, polished appearance designed to remind the world that they are not just surviving outside the royal system, they are thriving. And yet, within hours, the conversation wasn't about the film. It wasn't about the standing ovation. It wasn't about the message. It wasn't even about Sundance. It was about a moment that looked small, a moment that felt big, a moment that made people ask a very uncomfortable question: why didn't Harry hug Meghan? Not later, not privately, right there, in front of the cameras. Some viewers brushed it off instantly. Awkward angles, tight spacing, red carpet chaos. Others replayed the clip again and again, slowing it down, freezing frames, arguing over body language like amateur detectives. And then came the speculation, the kind that spreads faster than facts ever do. People noticed what they claimed were visible sweat marks. People noticed Harry's sudden physical hesitation. People noticed something that felt off. Now, to be clear, no one can crawl inside another person's head. No one can definitively say what someone was thinking in a split second under blinding lights and global scrutiny. But here's the thing. When you are a couple whose brand has been built on visible affection, visible unity, visible defiance together, any visible deviation becomes the story. And this wasn't just any event. This was Sundance. Sundance isn't a casual photo op. It's a pressure cooker disguised as an indie film festival. It's where credibility is tested, where reputations are weighed, where industry insiders watch not just the screen, but the people standing in front of it. Every movement is read. Every interaction is interpreted, especially when the people involved have spent years telling the world their story. So let me ask you something. If nothing was wrong, why did this moment feel wrong? That's where this story really begins. Because what the cameras captured in Utah wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no visible argument, no explosive scene. What made it unsettling was the quietness of it, the restraint, the subtle withdrawal, the kind of moment that only registers when you already know how something is supposed to look, and it suddenly doesn't. For years, Harry and Meghan have presented a united front that leaned heavily on physical closeness, hand-holding as armor, touch as reassurance, public affection as a statement. We are together, no matter what. So when that pattern breaks, even briefly, people notice. And they didn't just notice, they reacted. Within minutes of the footage circulating, social media lit up. Some people laughed it off. Others expressed concern. Some accused the internet of inventing drama out of nothing. And some said the quiet part out loud. This doesn't look like a glitch. This looks like tension. But here's the problem with viral moments. They rarely exist in isolation. They tap into something that's already been simmering beneath the surface. Because if this were the first time Harry appeared uncomfortable on a red carpet, the moment might have disappeared by morning. If this were the first time observers questioned their dynamic, it wouldn't have stuck. But it wasn't, and that's why it did. This Sundance appearance came at a very specific moment in their public journey, after documentaries, after interviews, after years of intense scrutiny. After building a media identity that relies on authenticity while simultaneously being carefully managed, that's a difficult balance, and pressure has a way of leaking out through the smallest cracks. Think about it. When you're relaxed, your body moves naturally. When you're stressed, your body hesitates. When you're uncertain, you pull back, sometimes without realizing it. Now multiply that by 1,000 cameras, a high-stakes premiere, and the knowledge that every frame will be dissected by millions of strangers who already have strong opinions about you. That's the environment Harry and Meghan walked into. And something shifted. Some say it was nothing more than discomfort under the lights. Others insist there was a trigger, a sensory detail, a moment of personal unease, a private signal that went public by accident. And then there are those who believe this was not about sweat or space or cameras at all. They believe it was about something deeper, about emotional fatigue, about control, about the cost of always performing unity. Because here's a contradiction worth sitting with. Harry and Meghan have spoken extensively about reclaiming autonomy, about stepping away from forced performance, about rejecting rigid expectations. And yet, their post-royal life has required a different kind of performance, one where intimacy, vulnerability, and togetherness are not just personal experiences, but public-facing assets. What happens when that becomes exhausting? What happens when the expectation to always look united collides with a moment when one person simply can't? This is why that almost hug mattered. Not because of what it was, but because of what it symbolized. A hesitation where there used to be certainty, a pause where there used to be ease, a visible break in rhythm. And rhythm matters, especially in relationships that the world feels entitled to analyze. Now let's slow this down. Let's rewind the night, the cold Utah air, the red carpet underfoot, the flashes, the smiles that appear on cue, the positioning, who stands where, who turns first, who reaches, and who doesn't. Because once you start paying attention, you realize this moment didn't happen in a vacuum. There were signs leading up to it, there were pressures surrounding it, and there were reactions afterward that only intensified the questions. And the most interesting part? Neither of them addressed it. No clarification, no casual laugh-it-off moment, no public correction, just silence. And silence in the age of constant communication has a way of speaking louder than words. So as we move forward, here's what we're going to do. We're going to reconstruct that moment carefully, calmly, without hysteria. We're going to look at what was visible, what was implied, and what people may be projecting onto it. We're going to explore why Sundance was such a high-pressure stage for this interaction, and why the internet latched onto this particular detail with such intensity. And most importantly, we're going to ask the question that keeps resurfacing. Was this just an awkward second caught on camera, or was it the first visible crack in a carefully maintained image? Because once you see it, really see it, it becomes harder to dismiss. And what happens next only deepens the mystery. What if the most revealing part of the night wasn't what anyone said, but what almost happened? Because that's where we left off, with a pause, with a hesitation, with a silence that felt heavier than applause. So let's go back to the exact second the atmosphere changed. Not metaphorically, literally. The cameras were already rolling. They always are. At Sundance, red carpets are less about glamour and more about scrutiny. The crowd is smaller than Cannes or the Oscars, but the attention is sharper. Industry eyes, critics, documentarians, people who pride themselves on noticing what others miss. Harry and Meghan step forward together. The smiles appear right on schedule. This is muscle memory by now. They've done this hundreds of times. Walk, pause, turn, smile, adjust, repeat. But something interrupts the rhythm. Watch it closely and you'll see it. Meghan leans slightly in. It's subtle, natural. The kind of movement you don't think about when you've shared 1,000 red carpets with the same person. Her body anticipates contact. Harry doesn't mirror it. He shifts his weight instead. Not dramatically, not abruptly, just enough. A half step, a fractional lean away. His arm doesn't rise, his hand doesn't reach. And for a split second, the choreography collapses. That second is everything. Because red carpets are choreography. People don't like to admit that, but it's true. Even the most authentic celebrity moments are guided by instinct, habit, and expectation. Couples develop patterns. They know where the other person will be before they get there, which is why disruption stands out. Now, let's be fair. Red carpets are chaotic. Photographers shout conflicting directions. Lighting is harsh. People are distracted. There are any number of innocent explanations for a missed cue. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This didn't look like confusion. It looked like refusal. Not aggressive, not angry, controlled, measured, almost instinctive. And that's why people reacted, because instinctive reactions tell you something words never will. Ask yourself this: when you're relaxed with someone, do you think about touching them, or does it just happen? Exactly. That's why this moment sparked so much debate. Not because it was dramatic, but because it broke a familiar pattern. Harry didn't just fail to hug Meghan. He actively created space. And space is communicative. The crowd didn't gasp. There was no audible reaction, But if you watch the footage from multiple angles, you can see the shift ripple outward. Meghan recalibrates almost immediately. She straightens. She smiles wider. She compensates. That, too, is telling. People who are comfortable don't need to compensate. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself, how many times have you seen these two navigate public moments together? How often has physical closeness been part of their shared language? Hand-holding, arms around waists, leaning in during interviews. Touch used not just as affection, but as reassurance. That's why this absence landed like a thud, because absence in this context isn't neutral, it's noticeable. And the internet noticed. Within minutes, clips were circulating, slowed down, zoomed in, annotated. People debated angles, lighting, intent. Some accused viewers of overanalyzing. Others argued that ignoring it was the real denial. But the most interesting reactions didn't come from fans or critics. They came from people who said, "Something about that made me uncomfortable, and I can't explain why." That's the power of body language. You don't have to consciously understand it for it to register. Your brain clocks it anyway. And here's where the conversation took a sharper turn. Because as people replayed the footage, they started pointing out details. Not just the missed hug, not just the distance, but the timing, the micro expressions. The moment just before Harry steps back, some claimed he noticed something physical. Others suggested he was already tense. Some argued the entire interpretation was projection. But let me ask you this. If it were nothing, why did it stick? Why didn't it vanish like 1,000 other awkward red carpet clips? Why did this one refuse to go away? The answer may lie in context. This wasn't a low-stakes appearance. This was a documentary premiere with personal investment baked into it. This was an event meant to communicate stability, success, and control. This was not supposed to generate questions about personal dynamics. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Because moments like this don't just get analyzed on their own. They get compared. People started pulling up older footage, other red carpets, in other premieres, other moments where Harry and Meghan moved as a unit. The contrast was stark. Then came the whispers. Not accusations, whispers. About stress, about fatigue, about pressure behind the scenes, about how exhausting it is to constantly perform unity when the cameras never stop watching. Think about that for a second. Imagine your relationship being treated as a public exhibit. Every touch scrutinized, every lack of touch questioned, every moment mined for meaning. That pressure doesn't just sit on the surface. It sinks in, and when it does, it shows up in small ways first, like a half step backward. Now, here's where things get more complicated, because it wasn't just what Harry did, it was what happened immediately after. Meghan recovers quickly. She always does. She turns toward the cameras. She engages. She smooths the moment over. If you weren't paying attention, you might miss the recalibration entirely. But Harry remains slightly out of sync. He smiles, but it's tight. He looks toward the crowd, not toward her. His posture stays guarded. And again, none of this is explosive, which is why it's so fascinating, because the quiet moments are where truth tends to leak. Loud arguments can be performative. Silence is harder to fake. Now, let's address the obvious counterargument. Isn't it possible that Harry simply didn't notice the cue? That the moment was misread? That the internet is inventing drama because it's bored? Of course it's possible. But possibility isn't the same as plausibility, and here's why. Harry has spent his entire life under cameras. He knows red carpet choreography better than most people know their morning routine. Missing a physical cue with your partner on a high-profile carpet isn't impossible, but it is unusual, especially when it deviates from years of established behavior. That's why observers didn't just say, "Oh, that was awkward." They said that was different. Difference is what triggers analysis. And once analysis begins, it doesn't stop at the surface. People began asking deeper questions. Has something changed between them? Is the pressure finally showing? Is this a momentary glitch or a sign of something structural? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what if this wasn't about the cameras at all? What if it was about control? Because in relationships that operate partly as public brands, control matters. Who leads? Who follows? Who sets the tone? Who decides when intimacy is displayed and when it's withheld? Withholding, in particular, is powerful. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty invites speculation. Now, consider the timing. This moment happens before the film screens, before the reviews, before the applause or criticism, before the night has a chance to declare itself a success or a stressor, which means whatever triggered this moment existed before the red carpet. It walked onto that carpet with them. And that's where the narrative shifts. Because once you accept that this wasn't an isolated blip, you start looking for precursors. Small signs, previous moments of tension, subtle shifts that were easy to dismiss at the time. And there are more than people want to admit. This is where the story stops being about a hug and starts being about pressure. Pressure to represent unity. Pressure to project confidence. Pressure to sell a narrative that may be harder to live inside than it looks from the outside. And that pressure doesn't always explode. Sometimes it just creates distance. A few inches at first, then a step, then a moment that freezes the internet. So here's the question I want you to sit with as we move forward. What if this red carpet moment wasn't the problem? What if it was the symptom? Because once you start pulling on that thread, you uncover something much bigger than a missed embrace. And in the next section, we're going to zoom in on the detail everyone pretended not to notice. The one that turned speculation into obsession and pushed this story from awkward to unsettling. Because that detail may explain why Harry stepped back and why this moment felt so loaded. What if the reason this moment refused to disappear had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with discomfort? Because once the internet slowed the footage down, once the freeze frame started circulating, once people stopped arguing about whether the hug was missed or refused, attention shifted to something else. Something smaller, something awkward, something nobody really wanted to say out loud at first. And yet, they did. Not all at once, not confidently, more like a collective hesitation. Did you see that? Is that what I think it is? Am I imagining this? Those questions multiplied quickly. Screenshots appeared. Circles were drawn, arrows pointed, comment sections filled with disclaimers. People began sentences with, "I don't want to be rude, but," or "I'm not judging, however," and that's usually the tell. Because when people feel the need to pre-defend their observation, it means they think they might be onto something uncomfortable. The claim, repeated again and again, was that Harry appeared to notice visible sweat marks on Meghan's outfit. That this detail, magnified by lighting fabric and high-definition cameras, triggered a reflexive reaction. Now, let's pause right here. This is where stories often tip into cruelty or exaggeration. And that's not what we're doing, because the point isn't the detail itself. Sweat happens, cameras are unforgiving. Anyone who's ever stood under hot lights knows how quickly discomfort shows up on the body. The point is the reaction, because humans are sensory creatures. We respond to sight, smell, texture, proximity, often without conscious thought, especially under stress, especially in public, especially when already tense. Ask yourself something. Have you ever instinctively stepped back from someone, not because you were upset with them, but because something in the moment made you uncomfortable? You didn't plan it, you didn't announce it, your body just moved. That's the argument many people began making, that this wasn't rejection, it was reflex. But here's the complication. Reflexes don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by context, mood, relationship dynamics, existing tension. And that's why this detail became so sticky. Because if everything between them was relaxed, affectionate, and emotionally easy, would a momentary physical imperfection trigger visible withdrawal, or would it be ignored? That's the question people keep circling back to. The fabric choice didn't help. Stage lighting didn't help. Nerves didn't help. Sundance, despite the cold outside, is notoriously warm under the lights. Add adrenaline, movement, and stress, and the body responds the way bodies do. But Harry's response, controlled, immediate, unmistakable, made people wonder whether this was less about the physical detail itself and more about what it symbolized in that moment, loss of control. Because sweat in public appearances represents something very specific in celebrity culture. It's not just moisture, it's imperfection, it's unpredictability, it's the body doing something unscripted. And unscripted moments are dangerous when your public image relies on precision. Now, think about Harry's position. He has spent years in environments where appearances are tightly managed, where discomfort is hidden, where physical details are monitored, corrected, adjusted behind closed doors. He's also spent the last several years rejecting that system, publicly, criticizing it, dismantling it, calling it suffocating. And yet, here he was, back under the lights, back under scrutiny, back in a moment where optics mattered. That contradiction alone is enough to create tension. So when something visually unexpected appeared, whether exaggerated by cameras or not, it may have triggered something deeper than embarrassment. It may have triggered anxiety. Anxiety doesn't announce itself politely. It shows up as avoidance, distance, withdrawal. And here's where the story sharpens. Because the internet didn't just notice the detail, it noticed the timing. Harry's hesitation happened right as Meghan leaned in, not before, not after, right then. Which suggests cause and effect, at least visually. Is that proof? No. Is it interpretation? Yes. Is it compelling? Absolutely. And once people latch onto a compelling interpretation, they start looking for reinforcement. They went back through other appearances, other events, other moments where Harry appeared uncomfortable under physical or sensory strain, crowded rooms, tight spaces, overwhelming situations. Patterns emerged, or at least perceived patterns. Harry has spoken openly about anxiety, about sensory overload, about discomfort in public environments, about the toll of constant exposure. That context matters here, because if he's already operating at a heightened stress level, small triggers can feel much bigger. That doesn't make anyone a villain. It makes them human. But here's the part that made people uneasy. Meghan didn't appear surprised. Her adjustment was immediate, practiced, almost automatic. She didn't recoil. She didn't confront. She compensated, which raises another uncomfortable question. Was this the first time something like this happened? Because people encountering a brand new reaction tend to pause, to look confused, to seek explanation. People encountering a familiar pattern adjust quickly. And that's what set comment sections on fire. Not mockery, not cruelty, recognition. Recognition of a dynamic where one person manages the moment while the other withdraws. Now let's zoom out. Why did this detail explode the way it did? Because it tapped into something broader than fashion or hygiene or nerves. It tapped into the idea that perfection is fragile, that carefully constructed images can be undone by something as ordinary as the human body. And when your entire public narrative hinges on authenticity while simultaneously being polished, that tension becomes impossible to hide. People didn't just see sweat, they saw vulnerability. And vulnerability, ironically, is not always welcome on red carpets, especially not when it threatens control. Here's another contradiction worth examining. Harry and Meghan have positioned themselves as champions of authenticity, of showing up as they are, of rejecting rigid expectations. And yet, moments like this reveal how hard that is to actually live out. Because authenticity is messy. It sweats. It hesitates. It doesn't always look good under stage lights. And when authenticity collides with performance, something has to give. In this case, it may have been physical closeness. That's why people didn't just gossip about the detail. They debated what it meant emotionally. Was Harry embarrassed? Was he overwhelmed? Was he trying to regain composure? Was he reacting to something specific or simply overloaded? And perhaps most importantly, did Meghan know exactly why he stepped back? Because if she did, that changes how you interpret her response. It stops looking like rejection and starts looking like accommodation. Accommodation implies awareness, and awareness implies history. Now, here's where we need to be careful. Speculation can spiral quickly. Not every adjustment is evidence of deep relational strain. Not every moment of discomfort signals a crisis. But when moments stack up, when reactions feel patterned, when silence follows instead of clarification, that's when people stop shrugging and start questioning, and silence is exactly what followed. No explanation, no dismissal. No, you're reading too much into it, just continued quiet, which allowed the detail to grow in significance. Because when public figures leave a vacuum, the internet fills it, and fill it did, with theories, with empathy, with judgment, with concern. Some viewers defended Harry fiercely, framing the moment as sensory overwhelm. Others criticized the reaction as insensitive. Still others saw it as proof of a relationship under strain. The truth, as always, likely lives somewhere in between. But here's the thing. Even if the trigger was purely physical, the reaction still tells us something. It tells us that the margin for error in their public appearances is razor thin. That stress is present. That comfort isn't guaranteed. And that brings us to the deeper layer of this story. Because sweat doesn't just make people uncomfortable, it makes control visible. And control, who has it, who loses it, who manages it, is at the heart of what unfolded on that carpet. In the next section, we're going to shift from physical detail to psychological signal, from what was seen to what was felt, from speculation to pattern. Because once you start reading the body language, the missed hug stops being an isolated moment and starts looking like part of a larger shift. And that shift may be saying more than either of them intended. What if the most honest part of that night wasn't the footage everyone replayed, but the tension nobody could caption? Because once the debate over details cooled, once people stopped arguing about fabric and lighting and reflexes, something else rose to the surface. Something harder to screenshot. Something more unsettling. The feeling that what we saw wasn't just a moment, it was a message. Not spoken, not announced, but broadcast anyway. Body language has a way of doing that. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for context. It leaks truth through posture, distance, timing. Through what happens when people think they're still performing, but their bodies are already reacting. And that's where this story deepens. Because when analysts, commentators, and even casual viewers began breaking down the Sundance footage, they didn't stop at the missed hug. They kept going. They noticed where Harry stood. They noticed where he looked. They noticed how long it took for him to re-engage, if he did at all. And suddenly, a pattern started to emerge. Let's slow it down. After the hesitation, after the space is created, there's a beat where Meghan turns fully toward the cameras. Her smile widens, her shoulders square. She takes control of the visual apparent narrative. This isn't accidental, it's adaptive. Harry, meanwhile, angles outward, not away from the crowd, away from her. That distinction matters, because if this were about shyness or nerves alone, you'd expect him to orient toward the one familiar presence beside him, toward safety, toward grounding. Instead, he does the opposite. He creates distance. Now, distance can mean many things. It can be about comfort. It can be about autonomy. It can be about overwhelm. But when distance replaces a previously consistent closeness, people start asking why, especially when this isn't the first time. Because if you zoom out beyond Sundance, you'll find moments, small, easily dismissed ones, where the physical choreography between them has shifted. There have been interviews where Meghan leans in and Harry remains rigid. Events where she reaches and he delays, walks where their hands don't meet as easily as they once did. Individually, none of these moments would matter. Together, they tell a story. And stories don't need dialogue to be understood. Ask yourself this. When someone pulls back repeatedly, what does that usually mean? Is it always rejection? No. Is it sometimes exhaustion? Yes. Is it often a signal of internal conflict? Absolutely. And here's the contradiction that makes this especially compelling. Harry has spoken openly about emotional awareness, about therapy, about understanding his triggers, about breaking cycles. He's positioned himself as someone deeply attuned to his inner state, which means when his body reacts this clearly, it's unlikely to be random. It's more likely to be protective. Protection doesn't always look gentle. Sometimes it looks like avoidance. Now let's talk about microexpressions, those fleeting facial movements that happen before people have time to mask them. In the Sundance footage, there's a flicker across Harry's face just before he steps back. It's fast, easy to miss, but it's there, not disgust, not anger, something closer to tension. A tightening. That's the face people make when they're bracing. Bracing for what? That's where interpretations diverge. Some believe he was bracing for scrutiny, others believe he was bracing for discomfort. Others still think he was bracing for a moment he didn't feel ready to perform. And here's where things get even more interesting. Meghan's body language suggests anticipation, not surprise. She leans in with confidence, with expectation. She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't check his position first. She assumes the usual response. That assumption tells you something. It suggests that, at least from her perspective, this moment should have unfolded normally, which means the deviation likely came from his side. Again, that doesn't assign blame. It assigns origin. And origin matters when you're trying to understand dynamics rather than demonize them. Now let's address a common dismissal. People often say body language analysis is pseudoscience, that you can't read meaning into posture or gestures without context. That's partly true, but it's also incomplete. Because while body language isn't a crystal ball, it is a pattern language. It doesn't tell you, especially when people suspect they've been papered over before. So here's the question we have to carry into the next section. If the body language was signaling something deeper, and if the physical detail merely triggered it, then what environment amplified it? Why did this happen here? Why Sundance? Why now? Because context doesn't just shape moments, it exposes them. And in the next section, we're going to step away from bodies and into pressure, into stakes, into the environment that may have made this moment inevitable. Because Sundance isn't just a backdrop, it's a catalyst. And what it demands from people can reveal more than they intend. What if this moment didn't happen in spite of Sundance, but because of it? Because once you stop staring at the footage and start looking at the setting, the hesitation begins to make more sense. Not excusable, not dismissible, but understandable. Sundance is not just a film festival. It's a test of credibility, a test of seriousness, a test of whether you belong in the room or are merely passing through it. That matters more here than almost anywhere else. This isn't Cannes, where spectacle is expected. It isn't the Oscars, where celebrity is currency. Sundance is different. It prides itself on restraint, on authenticity, on a certain unspoken skepticism toward anything that feels manufactured. And that creates pressure, a very specific kind of pressure. Because when you arrive at Sundance, you're not just showing a film, you're submitting yourself to judgment, not from fans, but from peers who see through polish and marketing instinctively. Now think about what Harry and Meghan were walking into. This wasn't just a premiere, this was a referendum on their storytelling, on their credibility, on whether their move from royal figures to content creators has depth or just reach. That's heavy, especially when you already feel like you're being watched for the wrong reasons. The irony is impossible to ignore. Harry and Meghan left the royal system in part to escape constant scrutiny, to regain control over their narrative, to choose their platforms, and yet here they were, standing on one of the most judgmental carpets in entertainment, one that doesn't applaud celebrity for celebrity's sake. At Sundance, fame doesn't protect you. Sometimes it hurts you, because it raises expectations. And expectations can suffocate. The documentary, Cookie Queens, wasn't just a creative project. It was symbolic, a statement, a continuation of a larger story they've been telling for years, about empowerment, about voice, about reclaiming agency, which means failure wasn't an option. But here's the problem with moments where failure isn't allowed. They don't leave room for vulnerability. And vulnerability doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It finds other ways out, like tension, like stiffness, like a half step backward at exactly the wrong time. Now imagine the mental load Harry may have been carrying. The film would be judged not just on its content, but on his presence, his seriousness, his comfort in this new role, his legitimacy as someone who belongs in a creative space, not as a curiosity, but as a contributor. That's a lot for someone who didn't grow up in this world. Royal life has rules, clear ones. You know where you stand. Sundance doesn't. It smiles politely while deciding whether you're substance or spectacle. And that ambiguity can be destabilizing. Add to that the personal stakes. This wasn't just Meghan's project. It wasn't just Harry's. It was theirs. Shared projects amplify relational dynamics. They blur lines. Stress doesn't stay neatly in one lane. It bleeds. Anyone who's ever worked closely with a partner knows this. Creative collaboration can strengthen bonds or strain them, especially when both people are invested not just emotionally, but reputationally. Because when something goes wrong, it's not just the work that's questioned, it's the partnership. Now layer the public onto that. Every glance becomes commentary. Every pause becomes evidence. Every misstep becomes narrative. There is no private processing. And that's where Sundance becomes a pressure cooker. Not because it's hostile, but because it's quiet. Quiet spaces amplify internal noise. And if there was already tension about the film, about expectations, about how the night would go, Sundance was the worst place for it to surface, because there's no room to hide. Now, consider this. If you were already feeling judged, already feeling out of place, already carrying the weight of proving yourself, how would you react when something disrupted your sense of control? Would you laugh it off? Would you lean in? Or would you instinctively create space? Space gives you room to breathe, and sometimes breathing feels more urgent than appearances. That's why some observers began framing Harry's behavior not as rejection, but as self-regulation, a way to steady himself. The problem is that self-regulation, when visible, gets misread, because the audience doesn't see the internal calculus. They only see the outcome, and the outcome in this case contradicted expectation. Now let's talk about Meghan's role in this environment. Unlike Harry, Meghan is fluent in spaces like Sundance. She understands industry dynamics, she understands the unspoken rules, she knows how to present herself as both insider and advocate. That's not a criticism, it's context. It means she likely felt at home, or at least competent, in a way Harry may not have, which can subtly shift dynamics. When one partner feels comfortable and the other doesn't, adjustments happen, sometimes unconsciously. One leans forward, the other pulls back. That doesn't mean conflict. It means asymmetry. And asymmetry under pressure becomes visible. Now ask yourself this. If this same moment had happened at a charity gala or a royal adjacent event, would it have landed the same way? Probably not. Because those environments are familiar, scripted, safe. Sundance isn't safe. It's evaluative. And evaluation heightens everything. That's why people didn't just ask, why didn't he hug her? They asked, what does this say about how he feels being here? That's a much deeper question. Because it reframes the moment from interpersonal to existential. Not about them, about him, about belonging, about identity, about whether this new chapter truly fits. And that's a harder narrative to dismiss. Now let's add one more layer. The documentary itself deals with themes of empowerment and visibility, of reclaiming space, of being seen. What happens when the very act of being seen becomes overwhelming? That irony wasn't lost on viewers. And irony fuels discourse. It makes moments feel symbolic even when they weren't intended to be. That's why Sundance mattered, because the setting amplified the symbolism. It turned a missed embrace into a referendum on comfort, control, and alignment. And once symbolism enters the chat, facts struggle to keep up. Which is why the reaction didn't fade. Instead, it expanded. People began wondering whether this pressure had been building for some time, whether other appearances showed similar strain, whether this was the first visible crack, or just the first one people noticed. And here's the thing, pressure doesn't create problems out of nothing. It reveals what's already there. It magnifies existing tension. It accelerates processes already in motion. So if Sundance exposed something, the question becomes, what was it exposing? Was it discomfort with the industry? Was it fatigue with performance? Was it strain within the partnership? Or was it simply the cost of living publicly without armor? The answer might be a combination, but one thing is clear. This moment didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in one of the most psychologically demanding spaces they could have chosen for a debut. And that choice, intentional or not, matters. Because Sundance doesn't just showcase films, it exposes people. And what it exposed here wasn't chaos. It was restraint. A restraint that hinted at something being held back, something unresolved, something waiting for a different moment to surface. And that leads us directly into the next chapter. Because once pressure reveals tension, the next question is obvious. Has this tension been growing? Has the warmth that once defined their public presence slowly cooled? And if so, when did that start? Because to understand what happened in Utah, we need to look backward, at the shift from public passion to public distance. And that shift may tell us more than any single red carpet moment ever could. When did the warmth start to fade? That's the question people began asking once the Sundance moment stopped being treated like an anomaly and started being treated like a data point. Because once you see distance, you start looking for its origin. And when you look backward with new recognizing eyes, things that once felt normal begin to feel adjusted, careful, different. Let's rewind, not just to Utah, but years earlier when Harry and Meghan's public image was defined by something unmistakable: closeness. They didn't just stand next to each other. They leaned, they touched, they mirrored, hands clasped like punctuation marks at the end of every appearance. Fingers interlaced as if to say, we're together in this, whatever this is. At the time, that physical unity was read as defiance against tabloids, against protocol, against pressure. It became part of their visual language. And visual language matters because once an audience learns it, they expect it, which means any deviation feels louder than silence. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. That visual language didn't disappear overnight. It thinned, gradually. So gradually, that many people didn't notice, until Sundance forced a comparison. Go back and watch footage from earlier years. The difference isn't just affection, it's ease. There's a looseness to the way they occupy space together. Less calculation, less management, less adjustment. Then, watch more recent appearances. The smiles are still there. The unity is still communicated verbally, but the physical shorthand has changed. Hands meet less often, distance lingers longer. Moments of connection feel timed rather than instinctive. Individually, each instance is explainable. Together, they suggest evolution or erosion, depending on how you read it. Now, evolution in public relationships is normal. People change, circumstances change. The intensity of constant scrutiny can drain even the most bonded couples. So this isn't about fault, it's about trajectory. And trajectories tell stories. One of the most telling shifts is not about what's gone, but about what's replaced it. In earlier appearances, physical closeness often acted as a buffer. When questions got sharp, when rooms felt hostile, they leaned into each other. In later appearances, that buffer seems less consistent. Instead of leaning in, Harry often leans outward, to the crowd, to the room, to anything that offers space. That's not rejection, it's regulation. But regulation has a cost, because when one partner consistently regulates by creating space, the other partner often regulates by filling it. That's how dynamics rebalance under stress. And you can see that rebalancing play out in subtle ways. Meghan engages more directly with audiences. She leads more interactions. She anchors moments visually. Harry follows, sometimes willingly, sometimes with visible effort. Again, not wrong, but different. And difference is what the internet finally noticed. Now ask yourself this: if Sundance hadn't happened, would people still be talking about this shift? Maybe not. But Sundance acted like a spotlight, not creating change, but illuminating it. Because the missed hug wasn't the first moment of distance. It was just the first one that disrupted the rhythm enough for people to stop scrolling. And once they stopped scrolling, they started comparing. People pulled clips from charity events, award ceremonies, walkabouts, interviews. They noticed moments where Meghan reached first, where Harry hesitated, where contact happened, but later, after a beat that hadn't existed before. Those beats matter, because beats create tension, and tension demands interpretation. Here's where it gets emotionally complicated. Public passion is easier than private endurance. At the beginning of any shared mission, adrenaline does a lot of work. So does novelty. So does shared opposition. Us against them is a powerful bonding force. But what happens when the enemy becomes less clear, when the fight shifts from external to internal? When the work becomes maintenance rather than rebellion, that's when relationships are tested, not by headlines, but by fatigue. And fatigue rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up as withdrawal, as restraint, as less touch, not more conflict. Now consider the timeline. After leaving royal duties, Harry and Meghan entered a period of intense output. Interviews, projects, documentaries, speaking engagements, constant narrative building. That pace is unsustainable without consequences, especially when your relationship is both personal and professional. Because then every disagreement is amplified, every stressor multiplies, every silence feels heavier, and over time, couples adapt. Some adapt by becoming more insular, others adapt by becoming more independent. Neither is inherently wrong, but when the adaptation becomes visible, the audience reacts, because visibility invites judgment. Now think about how carefully Harry and Meghan have spoken about each other publicly in recent years. The language remains supportive, loving, aligned, but language can lag behind feeling, especially when the brand requires consistency. Physical behavior, on the other hand, updates in real time. It's harder to script. That's why Sundance mattered so much. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a statement. It was a moment the body couldn't edit. And bodies remember things minds try to smooth over. That's why people felt like they were watching something transitional, not a breakdown, a shift from demonstrative unity to managed proximity. And managed proximity changes how a couple is perceived. It feels less spontaneous, more deliberate, less like instinct, more like strategy. Now, here's the contradiction that keeps people stuck. Harry and Meghan have consistently argued that the media overinterprets their actions, that scrutiny distorts reality, that narratives are imposed unfairly, and often they're right. But the more a couple insists on controlling their narrative, the more attention shifts to the moments that escape control. And this moment escaped because it didn't fit. So people asked, is this what happens when the honeymoon phase of public rebellion ends? Is this what long-term exposure does to intimacy? Is this what it looks like when a partnership transitions from passion to endurance? Those questions don't have scandalous answers. They have human ones. But human answers don't trend unless they feel unresolved. And this feels unresolved because there hasn't been a clear pivot, no visible redefinition of how they show up together, just incremental change. Incremental change is the hardest to process publicly. It invites speculation without closure, and closure is what audiences crave. Now consider how this affects perception going forward. Once people believe they've seen a shift, they look for confirmation. Future appearances get filtered through that lens. A missed touch becomes meaningful. A delayed smile becomes suspicious. A quiet moment becomes evidence. That's not fair. But it's how narrative momentum works. And right now, the momentum is pointing toward distance, not rupture. Distance, which is more unsettling, because rupture resolves itself quickly. Distance lingers. Now, let's connect this back to Sundance. If the warmth has been thinning over time, then the pressure cooker environment didn't create the moment. It accelerated it. It compressed a slow drift into a visible second. And that second did what years of subtle change couldn't. It made people look. And once they looked, they started asking not just what happened, but why. Which brings us to the project itself. Because if public distance has been growing, and if Sundance intensified it, then the next logical question is unavoidable. What role did the documentary play in all of this? Was it a unifying mission or a source of quiet friction? Because shared projects can either bring couples closer or expose differences they've been managing privately for a long time. And in the next chapter, we're going to step inside the documentary itself, not its content, but its impact. Because the film may not just be a backdrop to this story, it may be part of the reason the distance finally showed. What if the real tension that night had less to do with the red carpet and more to do with what the red carpet represented? Because by the time Harry and Meghan stepped into the lights at Sundance, the documentary wasn't just a film anymore. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. And verdicts change people, especially when the work on trial is personal, especially when it's been shaped by months, sometimes years, of conversations, compromises, disagreements, and quiet recalibrations that never make it into press releases. This is the part of the story most people skip past. They focus on the clip, they focus on the moment, they focus on the body language, but the truth is, moments like that rarely exist without a backstory. And the backstory here is creative pressure. Let's talk about shared projects. Anyone who's ever worked with a partner, really worked with them, knows how quickly boundaries blur. You stop being just two people in a relationship and start becoming collaborators, strategists, editors of each other's instincts. It can be exhilarating. It can also be suffocating. Now, multiply that by fame, multiply it by expectation, multiply it by the knowledge that whatever you produce will be interpreted not just as art, but as autobiography. Because for Harry and Meghan, no documentary is ever just a documentary. It's always read as a statement, a rebuttal, a continuation, a response to something that came before. That alone adds weight, and weight changes dynamics. By the time Cookie Queens reached Sundance, it wasn't simply a creative endeavor. It was a test of alignment, of whether their shared voice still sounded like one voice or two voices carefully blended. And blending takes effort, especially when the people involved don't come from the same creative background. Meghan understands storytelling as messaging, framing, narrative control. She's worked in industries where how a story lands can matter as much as the story itself. Harry's relationship to storytelling is different. He comes from a world where narratives were imposed on him, often without his consent. where stories were told about him, not by him, where control was something he fought for, not something he exercised comfortably. Those differences don't disappear when you collaborate. They show up in tone debates, in editing decisions, in how much to reveal, and how much to protect. And here's the part people rarely acknowledge. Creative tension doesn't have to be explosive to be exhausting. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just a constant series of micro decisions where one person feels the need to push and the other feels the need to pull back. Push for clarity, pull back for safety. That push-pull dynamic can look invisible from the outside, until it isn't. Now imagine carrying that dynamic into a premiere, a moment where all of those private negotiations are about to be judged publicly, where critics will read intention into every frame, where applause or silence will feel personal, whether it should or not. That's a lot to carry, and people carry things differently. Some lean in, some retreat, which brings us back to the red carpet, because the missed hug didn't happen in isolation. It happened right before the film was handed over to strangers, right before the work stopped being theirs, right before control ended. And for someone who's deeply sensitive to loss of control, that moment can trigger unexpected reactions. Here's a question worth asking. What if Harry wasn't reacting to Meghan at all? What if he was reacting to the moment when the project and everything it represented slipped out of his hands? That reframes everything. Because in that framing, the step back isn't personal, it's protective, a way to create psychological distance before impact. People do this all the time without realizing it. Before a big presentation, before bad news, before judgment, they pull inward. They minimize contact, they conserve energy, and sometimes the people closest to them feel it first. Now let's talk about another layer. Shared creative projects can quietly reorder power dynamics. Not because one person intends it, but because competence in a given space naturally shifts who leads. At Sundance, Meghan is in her element. She understands the room, she understands the language, she understands how these moments are supposed to unfold. Harry, by contrast, is navigating a world that still feels foreign, even years in. That imbalance doesn't mean anything is wrong, but it does mean stress manifests differently for each of them. And when stress hits, patterns emerge. One partner steps up, the other steps back, and over time, those steps become expected. Which brings us to the eyebrow-raising part of this story. Some observers noted that Harry's body language that night didn't just suggest discomfort, it suggested detachment. Not emotional detachment, situational detachment. As if he were already bracing for the outcome. As if he were distancing himself from the moment before it could define him. That's a subtle but important distinction, because detachment can be a coping mechanism, especially for people who've been burned by public judgment before. And Harry has, repeatedly. Now let's consider how this interacts with Meghan's role. If she felt confident in the project, invested in its message, and prepared for the moment, her instinct would naturally be to engage, to connect, to anchor, to present unity, which she did. And when that engagement wasn't reciprocated in the usual way, she adapted, not emotionally, professionally. That's the difference people keep missing. Her adjustment didn't look hurt. It looked strategic, which suggests this wasn't a surprise scenario requiring emotional processing. It was a moment requiring management, and management implies familiarity. That's what unsettled people, because it hinted that this dynamic, one pulling back, one compensating, might be something they've navigated before, just not under these lights. Now let's talk about the content of the documentary itself. Even without dissecting specifics, we know it touches on themes of visibility, empowerment, and reclaiming voice. Those themes resonate deeply with Meghan's journey. They also intersect painfully with Harry's, because reclaiming voice for him has often meant reopening wounds, revisiting trauma, exposing parts of himself he may not always want on display. That tension between telling the story and reliving it is exhausting. And exhaustion doesn't always show up as tears or anger. Sometimes it shows up as distance, as a refusal to lean in when leaning in feels like one more demand. So when people say, "Why didn't he just hug her?" they're asking the wrong question. The better question is, what was he protecting himself from in that moment? The answer may not be simple. It may be layered: performance fatigue, creative vulnerability, fear of judgment, loss of control. And when all of that converges, the body reacts faster than the mind can explain. Now let's address the silence again. After Sundance, there was no immediate reframing of the moment, no behind-the-scenes photo release showing affection, no interview anecdote laughing it off. That absence matters, because when public figures are confident a moment has been misread, they often correct the record quickly. When they don't, it suggests complexity, not guilt, complexity, which means the documentary likely touched something raw, not necessarily between them, but within him. And when one partner is processing something deeply internal, physical closeness can feel like pressure rather than comfort. That's hard for outsiders to accept because we like simple explanations. But relationships, especially public ones, are rarely simple. They're layered with roles: partner, collaborator, co-producer, brand. And when those roles collide, friction is inevitable. That friction doesn't mean collapse, it means strain. And strain shows up first in the body, before conversations happen, before narratives shift, before decisions are made. Which brings us to the question that naturally follows. If the documentary amplified existing tension, if Sundance stripped away the buffer, if body language revealed what words didn't, then what happens next? Because pressure doesn't just dissipate, it demands resolution, either through recalibration or through further distance. And the next chapter takes us directly into that territory, because when control becomes the central issue, who has it, who needs it, who feels it slipping, everything changes, including how people show affection, including when they withhold it. And in the next section, we're going to talk about control itself, not as a flaw, but as a force shaping what we saw, because what unfolded on that carpet may not have been about discomfort at all. It may have been about power. And power, once disrupted, never returns quietly. What happens when control becomes more important than comfort? That question hangs over everything that followed Sundance, even if no one said it out loud. Because once you peel back the layers of awkwardness, speculation, and body language analysis, you're left staring at something much harder to define and much harder to resolve. Control, not the cartoon version, not dominance or manipulation, but the quiet, invisible control that keeps things from spiraling, the kind people rely on when their lives are lived in public and the margin for error feels microscopic. Control over narrative, control over timing, control over how much of yourself is allowed to show, and perhaps most dangerously, control over how much closeness you can tolerate when everything else feels unstable. Up until recently, physical closeness had been part of Harry and Meghan's brand. It wasn't just affection, it was symbolism. A visual shorthand that communicated alignment without explanation, togetherness without qualifiers. But brands evolve, and sometimes they fracture. Not because anyone intends them to, but because reality starts pushing back against the image. Let's talk about control in public relationships. When you're constantly observed, control becomes a survival tool. You learn how to manage expressions, you learn which moments to allow and which to shut down. You learn how to perform ease even when you don't feel it. But here's the paradox. The more you try to control how you appear, the more pressure builds inside you. Eventually something gives. Sometimes it's your voice. Sometimes it's your patience. Sometimes it's your willingness to be touched. And that last one makes people deeply uncomfortable because touch is supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to signal safety. So when it disappears, people assume danger. But what if the danger isn't the relationship? What if the danger is losing control of yourself? That possibility changes the tone of everything. Because if Harry's withdrawal at Sundance was about control, then the moment wasn't about Meghan at all. It was about containment. Containing emotion, containing vulnerability, containing the sense that things might be slipping beyond his grasp. Remember, Harry has spoken repeatedly about feeling trapped by optics in the past, about how appearances became obligations, about how he felt consumed by expectations he didn't choose. Sundance, ironically, recreated that dynamic. Different institution, same sensation. Eyes everywhere, judgment implicit, no room to be off. So when Meghan leaned in, expecting the familiar choreography, Harry's body may have done what it's been trained to do under pressure. It pulled inward. Now, think about what that does to a partnership. When one person manages stress by creating distance, and the other manages stress by maintaining connection, a quiet tension forms. Not a fight, a mismatch. One seeks grounding through space, the other through closeness. Neither is wrong, but when they collide publicly, it looks like rejection, even when it isn't. And rejection, once perceived, is hard to unsee. Now let's talk about the brand itself. Harry and Meghan don't just exist as individuals or even as a couple. They exist as a narrative unit. Their story has been told, retold, defended, monetized, and challenged endlessly. That creates an additional layer of pressure most couples never experience. Because when you pull back physically, you're not just pulling back from a person, you're pulling back from a symbol. And symbols don't like ambiguity. That's why people reacted so strongly. The hug wasn't just